Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Leviticus. We've been spending a few days talking about the offerings, the sacrifices that are commanded by the Lord in the first several chapters of Leviticus. Today we begin looking at the sin offering. Now, the sin offering is the one we're most familiar with. In other words, when we think about the sacrifices of the tabernacle, the sin offering is the one that comes most readily to our mind, because we always think of an offering as being a covering for sin or making atonement for sin. We've already seen that all of those do not have that as their primary purpose. We've seen that the burnt offering is about total dedication. We've seen that the grain offering is about thanksgiving. We've seen that the fellowship offering is about being in fellowship with God. But with the sin offering, it is specifically for the making atonement when sin has contaminated someone's life. Now, the general outline of the sin offering is the same no matter who is bringing it, although there are some differences. For instance, there are differences when a priest brings the offering for his sin as to when a normal member of the community brings an offering for his sin. But even though there are some slight differences, the overall structure of the sacrifice is the same. I'm going to read a few verses to give us an idea how the sin offering worked. I'm reading from Leviticus 4, verses 33 and following. Now they bring the animal for the sin offering to the tabernacle, and it says they are to lay their hand on its head and slaughter it for a sin offering at the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered. Then the priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering. And he's to pour out the rest of the blood, that is, at the base of the altar. They shall remove all the fat, just as the fat is removed from the lamb of the fellowship offering, and the priest shall burn it on the altar on top of the food offerings presented to the Lord. In this way, the priest will make atonement for them for the sin they have committed, and they will be forgiven. So when you bring your sin offering, you bring it to the gate of the tabernacle. You again lay your hands on its head. It is standing in your place. Then the animal will be sacrificed in your stead. Now, all of the animal is not going to be burned on the altar. Just like the fellowship offering, only the fat connected to the internal organs will be taken. They would be placed upon the altar, and they would be consumed by the fire of the altar. They would make atonement for your sin. Now, as far as the rest of the animal, if it was a priest making the offering for sin, or if it was for the entire community, the rest of the animal would be taken outside of the camp and would be burned up. If it was just for a regular member of the community, the rest of the animal would be eaten by the priest. It's most holy, that is, it's dedicated to the priest, but they would consume it as they did in the fellowship offering. But notice that in the sin offering, the blood is placed on the horns of the altar, and then the rest poured around the base of the altar. That's for a regular member of the community. If it was a member of the priest, the blood would be taken inside the tent of meeting and sprinkled before the veil, which covers the Ark of the Covenant. And then the blood would be placed on the horns of the altar of incense inside the tent of meeting. And then the rest of the blood would be poured around the base of the altar. But now, the basic understanding here is that the sacrificed animal, blood he shed on your behalf, would make atonement for your sins, would purify your sins. Now notice something interesting. The blood is not applied to the worshiper. The blood is applied to parts of the sanctuary. It's applied to the horns of the altar in the courtyard for a regular worshiper. It's applied to the horns of the altar of gold incense in the tent of meeting for the priest when he ascends. The blood purifies the sanctuary for worship. It's interesting that in the Old Testament understanding, when sin has been introduced into the community of Israel, it contaminates the sanctuary of God. Our sin, we are the people of God, and our sin contaminates the space of God. He has given us the tabernacle as that holy space where we can meet with him. But our sin contaminates the space. And so what happens when we bring an offering is that contamination that our sin has brought is removed. The contamination is taken away. The place of worship is purified that we might approach God. I just find it interesting that the space God provides us to meet with Him becomes contaminated when we sin. But God has provided a means by which the contamination of sin might be removed so that we can approach God again in worship. You remember Leviticus is all about how an unholy people approach a holy God. And God has told us that our sin tends to contaminate our approach to Him. And even the space He has given us for us to come near becomes contaminated. So God has made the provision that when sin enters our life, with the sacrifice of the sin offering, the contamination of our sin can be removed and access to God can be restored so that we can approach Him in worship and know His grace. Isn't it wonderful that God always makes provision for us? That even when we contaminate our ability to approach God in worship, when our sin infects the place of worship, God has made provision by the sin offering that the infection, the contamination might be removed so that we can still approach Him, that we can still be in fellowship with Him, that we can still worship Him. God in His grace makes a way for us to approach Him and to come in worship. And the sin offering reminds us of that. God has made provision for us that the infection of sin, the contamination of sin can be removed, and so that we can still approach Him and worship Him and be in His presence. Our God is a gracious God, so wondrous in His mercy and grace to us. You have a great day today, and I hope to see you tomorrow as we continue our 5-minute Bible study in the book of the Leviticus.